1 minute ago, California woke up to a different kind of shortage. Not a wildfire, not an earthquake, not a strike. Fuel imports dropped, and the pumps started going dark. Lines formed before most people even understood what was happening. And the question everyone asked was the same. Why now? This is not a story about politics. It is not about one election, one governor, or one speech. It is not a story about villains or heroes. The truth is more uncomfortable. The truth is structural. It is incentives, not intent. It is policy, not panic. It is a system that has quietly shifted the cost of importing fuel until it stopped making sense. I'm Brooklyn. This channel follows money, timelines, and consequences. We do not chase headlines. We follow the chain reaction they hide. Mainstream coverage misses the links between policy, cost, and outcome. And that is where the real story lives. Here is the thesis. California did not experience this fuel drop because of one decision. It happened because the system made fuel imports mathematically irrational. This is not about politics. This is about math, incentives, and reality. And we are going to break it down step by step, from the first quiet signal to the moment the pumps went dark. In the months before the drop, the first signs were subtle. Not a crisis, not a headline, just small shifts in the way fuel moved through California. A tanker arrives later than scheduled. A storage terminal reports lower capacity. A refinery announces a maintenance extension. On paper, these look like normal operational blips. But the pattern begins to form. Early in the timeline, regulators started tightening emissions targets and expanding clean energy mandates. Not overnight, not as a single announcement, but as a series of adjustments. New rules for fuel content. New requirements for cleaner blending. New reporting standards for every step of the supply chain. The stated goal was clear. Lower emissions, cleaner air, reduced reliance on fossil fuels. The stated goal was also popular, but the incentives were not. Importers and refiners began adjusting their plans quietly, without making a show of it. Because when compliance costs rise, companies do not immediately announce a problem. They adjust. They reroute. They delay. They reduce exposure. They begin to treat California as a higher risk market, not because they want to, but because the economics demand it. At the same time, the state's infrastructure began to strain under the new requirements. Terminals required upgrades. Pipelines needed new permits. Storage rules changed. And every change created a new bottleneck, even if it was small. Because in fuel logistics, small bottlenecks compound quickly. The first ripple appeared before anyone realized it was a ripple. Import volumes started to wobble. Not dramatically. Not publicly. But the wobble was there. And the system, built for predictability, began to show its weakness. Because when fuel supply is treated as a constant, even a small shift becomes a problem. As the timeline moved forward, the shift became more noticeable. Not in public, but in the quiet language of logistics. Shipping routes began to change. Companies started redirecting tankers away from California ports. Not because the state was unsafe, not because demand dropped, but because the cost of operating there was rising faster than the margin could absorb. At the same time, refinery capacity began to shrink. Some refineries reduced output to avoid compliance penalties. Others scheduled longer maintenance windows to adjust equipment for new fuel standards. Still others began to reduce investment because the long-term forecast no longer justified the capital expense. The intended goal was clear: to accelerate the transition to cleaner fuels. The result was a shrinking supply base, quietly tightening the market. Storage rules also tightened, and that mattered more than most people realize. California began enforcing stricter limits on terminal storage and inventory. This reduced the buffer that normally protects the system from short disruptions. Fuel supply became less flexible, and that flexibility is the entire point of a supply chain. Regulatory compliance increased across the board. New reporting requirements. More frequent inspections. Higher penalties for even minor violations. Companies do not ignore compliance. They adapt, and adaptation costs money. It also slows down operations. The import pipeline began to break, but not with a dramatic failure. It broke with silence. Shipments became less frequent. Scheduling windows widened. backlogs formed at ports. And because fuel logistics depend on precise timing, the system began to wobble. The mid-phase escalation did not look like a crisis. It looked like a series of adjustments. But those adjustments were not neutral. They were cumulative. And the import pipeline, once treated as stable, was now beginning to fail quietly, without anyone in the public yet realizing what was happening. In the final phase, the shifts stopped being subtle. They became decisive. The first sign was insurance. Not the premium itself, but the availability. Fuel importers and terminals began facing higher risk ratings. Insurers started restricting coverage or demanding stricter conditions. When coverage becomes harder to obtain, companies stop expanding operations. They also stop taking on new risk. And that means fewer shipments, not more. At the same time, supply contracts began to change. Some were reduced. Others were cancelled. Not because companies wanted to withdraw, but because the contract terms no longer matched the risk. When a contract becomes unpredictable, it becomes unfinanceable. The math simply does not work. And when the math fails, the decision is no longer strategic, it is forced. Ports and logistics became the next bottleneck. California ports began to show strain as storage tightened and schedules slipped. Ships waited longer. Docking windows became scarce. And every delay increased cost. In a system built on precision, delays are the same as taxes. The state's emergency reserves also weakened. Fuel reserves are designed to cover short disruptions. They are not built to replace a broken import pipeline. As reserves drained, the system became more fragile. And when fragility rises, the next disruption becomes far more severe. The final decisions were not dramatic announcements. They were quiet risk calculations. Importers reduced shipments. Refiners lowered output. Terminals limited storage. And the system reached a point where the drop was no longer avoidable. Because once the supply chain becomes too costly to maintain, the decision is not to cut back. It is to stop expanding, and in some cases, to withdraw. That is the moment the import drop became inevitable. Not because of a single event. Because the system had been reshaped into a structure that could no longer support the previous level of supply. Fuel imports are not a simple delivery. They are a continuous chain of timing, capacity, and cost. A ship carries fuel to a port. The port unloads it into storage terminals. Then pipelines, trucks, and rail move it to refineries and distribution centers. Each step is scheduled in advance. Each step depends on the previous step happening on time. If one step slips, the entire chain slows. Refinery economics are built on thin margins. Refiners make money by processing crude into gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. The profit comes from the difference between crude cost and finished fuel price. That difference is small, and it fluctuates constantly. When costs rise, refiners cannot simply raise prices without losing demand. When compliance costs rise, they must absorb them or reduce output. Either way, margins shrink. Logistics add another layer of complexity. Fuel is heavy, dangerous, and regulated. Shipping routes require permits. Storage requires safety and environmental compliance. Ports operate on tight schedules. A single delay can ripple through weeks of planning. So when the system is stable, the chain runs smoothly. When the system becomes uncertain, the chain breaks. California is especially vulnerable because it is geographically isolated from the rest of the country's fuel network. It is not connected to the national pipeline system. That means it relies heavily on imports and local production. When imports drop, there is no quick alternative. The state cannot simply pull fuel from a nearby pipeline. The system is not redundant. It is exposed. The real hidden tax in this system is uncertainty. Every new regulation, every delay, every risk factor increases the unknown. And unknown costs are not absorbed by companies. They are priced in. That means companies raise their risk assessment and then they reduce exposure. They ship less. They import less. They invest less. In a supply chain built on predictability, uncertainty is the most expensive cost of all. Translation: uncertainty is not a minor inconvenience. It is the tax that breaks the model. And when the model breaks, the public experiences it as empty pumps. To understand the scale, imagine a major import terminal on the California coast. This terminal is built to handle 300,000 barrels per day. That is enough fuel to keep millions of cars moving for weeks. On paper, the terminal is viable. It is profitable. It is part of a system designed to run smoothly. Now at the first delay. A new compliance requirement forces a terminal upgrade. The upgrade costs $75 million and takes 6 months. The terminal can still operate, but at reduced capacity. That reduction is not small. It means the terminal now handles 240,000 barrels per day. That shortfall is not covered by local production because California is not connected to the national pipeline system. So the state must import more from elsewhere at higher cost. Next, add insurance costs. Because of increased risk ratings, the terminal's insurance premiums rise by 30%. The terminal pays millions more per year just to stay covered. When the insurance market tightens, some coverage becomes unavailable. That means the terminal must limit operations to stay within acceptable risk. Now add logistics. Shipping schedules become unpredictable. Ships wait longer at ports. Docking fees increase. Every extra day a ship waits, the cost rises. A delay of just 10 days can add tens of millions in expense. And those costs are not absorbed by the terminal. They are passed along, or they reduce profit until the project becomes unsustainable. Finally, add the infrastructure tax. The grid and pipeline upgrades needed to move fuel inland are delayed. So the terminal cannot operate at full capacity even when it wants to. It becomes a bottleneck. And bottlenecks are where supply chains break. Here is the key point. A terminal that was viable under stable conditions becomes mathematically irrational under uncertainty. The costs compound. Delays increase financing costs. Compliance adds new capital expense. Insurance raises operating costs. Logistics increase every day. And when the numbers stop adding up, the terminal reduces operations or pauses entirely. Translation: the system does not collapse because of one event. It collapses because the math changes. And once the math changes, the decision to import less is not a choice. It is a necessity. Domino 1. Consumers face empty pumps. The first domino hits the public immediately. Fuel imports drop, and the system loses its buffer. Gas stations begin to run out of supply. The pumps go dark. Lines form. People start driving from station to station, searching for fuel. Prices rise because the market reacts to scarcity, not panic. And the public experiences the result without ever seeing the chain behind it. This is the visible moment, but it is not the origin. Domino 2. Transportation, delivery, and logistics industries suffer. The second domino lands on the logistics sector. Trucking companies operate on tight margins and tight schedules. When fuel is scarce, they cannot plan routes reliably. Deliveries slow. Schedules slip. Some routes become unprofitable. Fleets begin reducing hours, cancelling runs, and delaying shipments. The ripple spreads from freight to retail to manufacturing. When goods cannot move, the economy begins to freeze in place. And this domino does not stop at the state border because supply chains are national. Domino 3. Businesses, local economies, and emergency services face strain. The third domino affects local communities. Businesses that rely on daily deliveries see inventory gaps. Restaurants cannot receive ingredients on time. Construction projects halt because fuel is needed for equipment and transport. Small businesses lose customers because people are focused on fuel, not spending. Local economies weaken quietly, without dramatic announcements. Emergency services also feel the impact. Fire response, ambulances, police vehicles all require fuel. If supply becomes unreliable, response times and coverage are affected. This is not speculation. It is the predictable outcome when an essential supply becomes unstable. These dominoes expand the scope of the crisis. What starts as a supply chain issue becomes a community issue. Then it becomes a state issue. And finally, it becomes a national issue. Because California's economy is not isolated. It is connected to every major industry in the country. When California slows, the nation feels it. The system is the story, but the impact is personal. It does not arrive with a headline. It arrives in a paycheck. Meet Javier, a long-haul truck driver based in the Central Valley. He drives fuel and goods across the state. His work is scheduled down to the hour. He has a routine, a route, and a steady income. Then the supply starts to wobble. Fuel becomes harder to find, even for drivers. His dispatcher begins rerouting him, adding hours, adding miles. The pay does not increase, but the costs do. Gas, tolls, maintenance, time away from family. His weekly hours drop because runs become unavailable. He does not lose his job. He just loses the work that made his job sustainable. The pressure builds quietly, without a dramatic event. He starts taking shorter shifts. He starts saving less. He starts wondering how long this will last. Now meet Lila, a gas station owner in a suburban strip mall. Her station is small, but it is stable. She has employees. She has rent. She has loans. She has a schedule. Then the deliveries begin to thin out. Her pumps go dry for a day. Then 2 days. Then the lines form. Customers become anxious. Some leave without buying. Some pay more than they planned. Lila's revenue becomes unpredictable. She cannot plan inventory because she does not know when the next delivery will come. Her staff hours shrink. She keeps employees on, not because business is strong, but because she does not want to lose them. The pressure is constant, not dramatic. Her profit margin disappears slowly. She watches the numbers tighten, and she knows the problem is not her business. It is the system. This is the quiet human cost. Not a single dramatic event. No one collapsing. Just steady pressure. Reduced hours. Shrinking income. A normal life becoming harder because the supply chain, which most people never see, stopped working the way it was supposed to. The irony is clear, and it is hard to ignore. Policies designed to reduce dependence on fossil fuels and build a cleaner future are now contributing to an immediate shortage. The goal was stability through transition. The result is instability during the transition. That is not a moral judgment. It is a structural contradiction. The state pushed for cleaner standards, stricter compliance, and tighter logistics. The intention was to reduce harm. But the system did not have the capacity to absorb the change at the pace demanded. The supply chain was reshaped before the infrastructure was ready. And when the infrastructure fails to match the policy, the market responds. It reduces exposure. It shrinks operations. It withdraws. This is the broader warning. Because this model is not limited to fuel. It is being repeated in other industries. Electric grid mandates collide with new industrial demand. Housing policies collide with labor and material shortages. Environmental rules collide with manufacturing capacity. And each time the system is pushed faster than it can adjust, the result is a drop in supply, not a rise in compliance. This is not an isolated incident. It is a system warning. The chain reaction is already visible in other sectors, and it is only a matter of time before the next shortage shows up in a different form. When the system is forced to change faster than the infrastructure can support, the public does not experience the policy. They experience the shortage. And shortages are not a message. They are a symptom. California's governor didn't get blindsided by politics, he got blindsided by the math. A sudden drop in fuel imports didn't happen because of one headline, one accident, or one bad day. It happened because the system shifted and the incentives changed. Regulations, compliance costs, and infrastructure limits quietly raised the cost of importing fuel. When the numbers stopped adding up, importers didn't announce a crisis, they reduced supply. And when supply drops, the public experiences it as empty pumps, long lines, and sudden panic. The result is a slow-motion breakdown, not a sudden explosion, and the consequences are still unfolding. Here's the accountability question I want you to answer, one word only, in the comments. Who is responsible when a state's rules make essential supply unreliable, leaders or regulators? Drop your answer below and tell me why. If you want more investigative breakdowns like this, hit subscribe, like, and share this video with someone who still thinks shortages happen by accident. Because this story isn't over, it is still being written right now, and the consequences are still unfolding.